Hello, everyone. Koronik here, and I am here with Diz as well, and we are going to be doing something a little special for you guys. We're talking about Labyrinth of Touhou. Now that I've finished the main part of the game, and Diz has too, we're going to kind of do a full review of the game and kind of talk a little bit about our experiences with it and see how kind of just talk about it. So, hey, Diz, thanks for joining.
Greetings, folks, and I'm happy to have. This game was quite a journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, what was your total time taken on it by the end? You've shown me some clips, and you were way over 700 hours. So
Yeah, my total playtime as of my latest file is 754 hours.
wow, that's amazing. And now to be fair, you did do the did you for this playthrough did you do the 256-hour wait part or not?
I did do this too. I did that wait part, so I
Okay,
had a pre-set up file. For those not in the know,
yeah,
you can wait essentially for the better part of 11-ish days to get the 2 million money achievement at the beginning of the game, and that's
right.
something I did,
So
something Karunik did not do in his playthrough.
so you ended up with about around 500 hours of actual gameplay.
Yeah,
Wow. Yeah, I finished up in between. I think it was like 305 or 306, something like that. Still a long time, but yeah, it is a long game, and so it's hard to do. There's probably not a whole lot of people who have done a full review of the game after playing it all the way through, including the plus disc.
yeah, because those plus disc contents, they're quite a long journey to get through comparatively to the base game and its post game, which the bulk of your hours ended up being in Plus Disc, which makes a lot of sense given what it has.
Yes.
Thankfully, the game wasn't too grindy up until the end, so that seems like it was probably really nice.
Yeah, it worked pretty well. I mean, it's one of those games where definitely. Well. So in the first part of the game, I had the limitations of the. I was trying to maintain the proper levels for the wins, um,
Hmm.
which meant that the way that works, it still is a little bit grindy because what you can do, even though you can, even though you kind of limit your level when you actually do the fight, you still get the level up bonuses for any over leveling you've done when you do that. So you do still gain something by leveling, just not quite as much. And then you're also limited in the number of library levels you can take.
Yeah, that's hard mode stuff as well, where the limitations are superimposed on you, where you can't even take on certain challenges unless you meet the minimum requirements of a
Right.
certain boss and everything like that. And hard mode rules probably don't ever have to be superimposed on you, even if you are playing Plus Disc, because those restrictions are lifted immediately in the post game.
Right.
But with 56 characters in total, there is a lot to play with the game.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If there's one thing this game has, it's definitely variety.
Hmm.
It is an insanely inventive JRPG with so much content to the point where you kind of called the bosses like puzzles.
Yeah, some of them are. I mean, the early ones are so. The thing about it, the thing about the game that kind of got me, and I found was both frustrating and interesting, is that the
Hmm.
first few bosses, it kind of feels just like your standard JRPG. You fight monsters, you level up, you get new equipment, you throw it on your people, and eventually you're strong enough to take on the boss, and you take the boss out, right? Later on, you get these boss fights where if you simply maintain that strategy that, oh, I'm just going to kind of walk around and level up and look for all the treasure and equip all the best equipment, you still find that some of these bosses are not impossible, but they will wipe your party in, you know, 2 turns kind of thing, or you just can't do any damage to them kind of thing. There are a lot of tricky bosses in this game, both in the standard game and in the plus disc, where you really need to fine-tune your strategy and sometimes even the characters that you bring along in order to
Mhm.
have the right mix of abilities to be able to take out the boss at all. Some bosses, you need people who can do physical damage, or you need people who can do magical damage. Later on, you have requirements that you need to do certain types of elemental damage, and they also
Right.
need to be, not direct or not magic. And then later on after that, you even get to a need of doing piercing damage, which is
Yep.
not really one of those things that is described too clearly in the game itself. You kind of end up needing to head over to a wiki or something and say, well, who has piercing damage? Because it's not obvious, and it's not just as easy as it says this damage. If you just went with the characters whose attacks have this pierces defense in the description,
Mhm.
you're limited to like 2 moves on 3, 3 moves on 2 characters kind of thing. Whereas it's actually a lot more complicated than that. For instance, one of the moves I stumbled onto early on was Yugi's KO in 3 steps, which actually has a pretty decent amount of damage piercing, but they don't tell you that.
Yeah. So the game is really talking about things like damage formulas and stuff like that, which are normally invisible to the player.
Right,
While technically speaking, the game is pretty good about telling you when it's doing something, it's not going to tell you how much. For
right.
instance, you have the piercing attack on a character like Rumia, and piercing attack from that skill is something that is stated as something it does, but it
Yep,
does not actually fully pierce. Now you have to go to characters that have complete piercing, like her Dark Side of the Moon spell or Aki's Last Judgment, which outright state it completely ignores any defense in the calculations of damage.
right,
And you see, that's the thing. The game tells you a lot, but it doesn't tell you everything. You have to go to a character sheet on the wiki to get a good idea of formulas. This can lead to a lot of frustrations, of course, like you mentioned, getting frustrated with how you have to change things around and really just kind of trial and error a lot of bosses because
yeah,
you're not going to know what they do first out, and reading a wiki all the time for it is probably not the most riveting thing to do because there is a level of satisfaction of being able to figure out bosses on your own. But even then, the wiki itself is not perfect either. As
right.
kind of demonstrated, the wiki seems to be written by people who have played this game with very specific characters, and they recommend very obvious characters that can go to this.
Right, right.
Whereas you and I kind of stuck with the team we wanted to use more often than not. You
Yeah.
switched around a lot of characters at the beginning, but eventually you kind of narrowed down into the characters you really wanted to use and like the most.
It was at
And
the point where I kind of had a good synergy between the characters. I kind of had a
mhm,
little bit of everybody, a little bit of every element, some magic, some attack, and in addition to that, once the library levels start to become like an actually big effect on your character, like by the end of the game, the amount of stats I was gaining from library levels was huge, compared
mhm.
to the base stats. So, once that happens, characters get left behind because you just can't afford to put library levels on everybody. And so, characters just become unviable basically unless you're willing to spend a million money on them or whatever.
And even then, there are certain characters with different library costs compared to others. So while you
Yes.
got cheap characters like Aku and Chen, you got some really expensive characters like, say, ironically, it's really funny, but Petuli herself has a really high cost, and she owns the library, so you know.
Right. Well, so there's actually one of the achievements I believe that kind of pokes fun at that,
Hmm.
where it says that Patchy's actually giving you a pretty good deal. It's not her that's getting rich off of this. It's the guy who sells all the spell materials. at the
Yeah,
store in the village.
yeah, of course, I remember that. And I love the game's sense of humor as well.
Yes.
It had some really charming dialogue, especially in the beginning when you made your, I believe it was your only short
Right.
regarding this, where, they screamed die, and it's
Yeah.
like, oh, why'd they run away? Oh, I love
Hmm.
that a lot. But
Yeah.
I do like that the story had its moments where it took itself seriously and had some of these heavy emotional beats too,
Right.
with the main parts and gimmicks of the games.
Yeah.
It's really cool because it tells a very powerful story in the grand scheme of things within the Toho setting. It fits right into the universe, and I like that a lot because it's written to be very canon friendly as well for anybody out there who reads the manga.
Right.
Yeah, and all the other stories. Yeah, it reads like a very true to form Toho thing, even down to the humor.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's a completely different animal from like the actual original Toho games, right? The original Toho games are these brutally hard top down shooters,
Yep.
and this is a brutally hard isometric dungeon crawler.
Yeah, very Etrian Odyssey in its style and execution. A lot of people will point to that series, be like, yeah, this very much reads out like that. But I do
Yeah,
like that it's distinguished from Etrian Odyssey in a lot of different ways, including in its gameplay and certainly its roster.
yeah,
The medley of bosses at the end certainly lend itself to its own unique style. Like, oh my goodness, King being a reference to one of the hardest, but also one of the greatest JRPG battles made. And it's
yeah.
like, I think the Toho lens for that really is interesting. But go ahead.
No, I mean, there's also a good number of bosses who are well. So there are a good number of bosses who aren't just like references, but they're also like jokes themselves, like the Big C or whatever they call it, right? It's
Yeah,
literally just it's. I guess that's technically a reference too, but like
a
you could
cookie clicker
it's
boss,
a cookie
yes.
clicker boss, right? But like where it just constantly spawns more cookies for you to fight if you're not doing it right.
hmm
But like the idea of you're fighting, you know, this ghostly devil creature that spits magic at you, or you're fighting, this embodiment of a magic tome that is that's casting dangerous spells, or you're fighting all the different characters that you end up fighting on the way through the game or stuff like that, and then all of a sudden you just get to a boss and it's like it's a cookie. Fight the cookie, and you're like, why am I fighting the cookie? It's just like fight the cookie. Oh, by the way, this is one of the hardest bosses up to this point that you'll fight. In fact, you'll probably have to come back to it. See ya.
Or you can take a highly specific strategy to completely delay its turn and use piercing damage to get through it. There are some really funny things with it. It
Yeah.
almost is the equivalent to the shoot 'em up style game where they have
Right.
safe spots on certain bosses.
Right.
There are certain exploits that work for different characters and different bosses, and even the shadows themselves, because man, there are so many refights of Toho characters in other
Yeah. Yeah.
forms. And I think a lot of them ended up being quite interesting, especially due to the fact that the game tends to favor you picking the team you like the most and letting you stick with it
Yeah.
without punishing you too bad. I do like that the game does that,
There's a
so
there's
it
a
doesn't
bit
feel.
I would say there's a little bit of a balance issue. There's definitely a pretty strong like tier sense in the game, right? Like this is one of the problems we have with the wiki is that the
hmm
wiki, once you get to the plus disc, all of the level recommendations in the real game kind of go away. But the wiki has all these level recommendations for you, and these recommendations seem to be based on choosing a fairly well optimized team.
Yeah.
And in general, since you get these 56 characters over the course of 200 hours of play or something like that, you don't know that, oh, this character's coming up next who's going to be really useful. And so you're very much, inclined to build a team early on and try to stick with them. Whereas, you get neatery. You get neatery pretty, not too late on, but even by the time you get neatery, you've probably already got 12 people before you get her. And similarly, there's another character with the insanely overpowered maintenance skill.
Yeah,
That's
Renko
Renko,
and Nitori, and
and you get
there
her
is
way
Miko as
later.
well.
Yeah,
But Miko isn't too broken, all things considered, because
right.
they have a counterbalance in the fact that they have the worst level up rate in the game and stuff like that,
Yeah,
which can be counterbalanced if you're as dedicated as I was into finding things out. So the difference between our playthroughs, I remember very distinctly. You were going with all sorts of main equipments that were helping and supporting, and I was
yeah,
going with pure EXP build
right,
just to see what that was like. And a character like Miko, Nitori, and Renko can overcharge their own EXP comparatively to the rest of the cast
yep,
because of that, as well as all sorts of other crazy hullabaloo like that. And
right,
if you're using characters that broken, then the game's not nearly as fun or engaging because you're just essentially playing around a win button.
right, right.
And sometimes it's not handed to you, but yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really liked is that, yes, I could have switched over to the win button if I felt like it, but at the same time, it was only a little bit more work to get my, not totally optimal team to over the finish line in most of these boss fights.
And all things considered, the characters you did pick weren't too bad in the end of things. You had some really good choices and characters that were really well utilized. If anything, this is a really good showcase that your favorite character is actually viable in the game, where a lot of people say that they aren't because they haven't used the setup that you had for them. And
Right.
it's like that, where I made those suggestions for all sorts of different characters, but I was pretty forthcoming in things like my analysis of which characters are really not worth using. And I
Yeah.
remember one of the low class ones being an example like Kaguya, who actually is the only character in the game with a void weakness.
Right.
So, yeah, that does not help them. Whereas you have a complete opposite, like Maribel, who has like 400 void resistance, the highest in the
Right.
game.
Yeah.
And the game doesn't tell you anything about that. It'll tell you every other element, but not those hidden ones and
Yes.
stuff like that. And you see, it is a very wiki dependent game. I don't find that to be necessarily a bad thing. The first game kind of had that mark too, if not a little worse, because the game
Yeah.
explained even less back then.
Right.
But when it comes to this game, it really does show as much as it needs to still be engaging, even if you weren't to read the wiki. But it would
Right.
certainly help. Like,
Yeah.
I could see
I mean,
somebody getting through it without the wiki, but I think they wouldn't have the same grand experience that I had or you had.
the frustration level I think would stop them from moving forward in some cases. I would say like, I
Mhm.
mean, it's one of those things where because you start out with like the JRPG bosses, where it's just like, oh, we'll be roughly strong enough. It'll be a tough fight, but we'll be able to take this boss out. To the first puzzle boss, where it's like, oh, we can't possibly win this fight as we are now. Now what? It's such an abrupt change
Mhm.
that it's very easy to get frustrated there and say, well, I guess I give up. I can't win. Either that or say, I guess I'll start over again in normal mode, and I'm just going to over level like crazy and just go through because both of those choices, one of those choices results in you ending the game early, which is not what you want to do, and the other one results in you picking a win button, basically,
Mhm.
a little bit more time invested win button, but a win button nevertheless, and playing the game through that way, which isn't as rewarding as actually realizing that, oh, these aren't, generic JRPG boss fights anymore. These are actually puzzles, and I need to figure out the answer, or to the puzzle in order to have a reasonable chance of success. It's one of those things where, because they don't because they change the way that the bosses work, 20, 30 hours into the game, suddenly you're like, well, I just can't win this fight. And then, maybe you give up on the game or whatever. But, like, the actual answer is for... Or it would have been nice if there had been a little bit more dialogue of, like, this boss isn't like the ones we fought before. We're going to need to think of a good strategy or something like that. But once you learn that it is that it will sometimes be required for you to poke at a boss and figure out what their weaknesses and strengths are, figure out if there's any ways to exploit the types of attacks they have, or to use your character's abilities to exploit weaknesses that they have that are not obvious, is one of those things where that change in perspective, knowing that was the case, really helped me maintain my enjoyment of the game, because otherwise you would just end up in a bunch of fights where it's like, oh, I can't win. Okay, next fight, I overlevel like crazy, finally I win. Next fight, oh, I can't win,
Mm-hmm. For a good majority of the base game bosses and stuff like that, you had a good chunk of them that were actually susceptible to something like death. So
Yeah.
you remember the glowing azure giant.
Right.
You could just instant death him if you were lucky and did a few rolls for it in the beginning of the battle. And
Right.
I thought stuff like that was interesting, and it kind of fell by the wayside when you got to Plus Disc, because the game just throws you bosses that are like, oh, nope, we're never going to be death, no matter how hard you try, because we have like 200 resistance or something.
Well, to be fair, the typical JRPG boss you can never death, right?
Mm-hmm.
With like a few jokey exceptions. I'm thinking of like the Phantom Train in Final Fantasy VI kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
When you get into most JRPGs, you find that debuffs and status ailments are useless about 20 minutes into the game, and you never have to worry about using them again. Like, I'm playing Dragon Quest III right now, and it's like, the enemies are now resistant to debuffs, and the enemies are resistant to things like Stop Spell, where, there's a spell that you can cast that's supposed to be able to stop the enemies from casting spells back at you, but it works like 30% of the time. And so it's not really a good investment of your turn, you know what I mean? Whereas in this game, even bosses late game sometimes have these unusual resistances, or lacks of resistance, more specifically, to things like status ailments, or even like particular like elements where you can really pinpoint their weakness and do something with it. Like the cookie thing is an example of that, right?
Yeah, I'd say so, because
in order to fight the cookie boss, you had to you could do it a couple of ways. Way number one is the way that you mentioned, with like piercing and paralysis spam, basically, right?
Pierce and shock spam, actually.
Yeah, pierce and shock spam. That's right. But then the other way that you can do it is you can do it the way where you basically let the cookie spawn out the extra cookies, and then you use poison to get them all down to one hit point, and then kill them all at the same time. Which means that, number one, you have to have people in your party that can do poison. Number two, you can't have people in your party that do counterattacks. And number three, that you're actually in for a fairly grueling fight, because they all have a lot of hit points and defense and stuff like that. So, like, there's a lot of little neat solutions like that where, you would never expect a boss in a standard JRPG 100 hours in to be like, oh yeah, you poison him and you wait for his hit points to go to 1, and then you hit him for 1 damage and you win. It's like, that never happens. But it does happen in this game, which is totally outside what you might expect.
Yeah, there's a lot of variety in its mechanics, and it definitely has what game designers would call depth in that sense, because I think it's a really solid foundation. This also means that most people who are playing the game can actually build a dedicated scouting team where they can
Yep.
use all the different status ailments and pierce damage and stuff like that to find out what works. It's not something you ended up doing too much in your playthrough, but I do know on my end what I used to do to kind of get a feel for how things are is I would do certain types of status effects and be like, oh, well, I can do that to this boss. I'll keep it in mind. I'll jot that down for later.
Right.
And oh, so they are weak to debuffs, but they don't take status ailments, or be
Right.
like, or vice versa, or something
Yeah.
akin
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
that. And it's like you could do that for theoretically every boss in the game, and you would still have your fair share of abilities at the disposal, at the ready. But the game really does encourage kind of like the one team you want to stick with.
Hmm.
So it's mainly just seeing which mechanics that your team will be able to make the best use of
Right.
because it's entirely impossible to level absolutely everybody in the library to be as viable because you kind of have to narrow down your cost efficiency to the team you like the most. So
Right. Yeah.
you could wind up in a situation where, like you mentioned, a suboptimal team by the standard of the game, it can get punished later. For instance,
Yeah.
you have something like a team that is focused on evasion, and then you run into the one boss that can't miss at all,
Yep.
and
Yep.
evasion is completely useless in that fight. And so it can be frustrating in that sense where you have some characters deadlocked and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
hindsight and foresight really do come to the forefront. And that's kind of where it ties back to the wiki, where you
Right.
kind of really need to look at the wiki to be able to make sure you're not going to make a bad investment into a character. But your playthrough really does show that you can make most characters work that are not as viable. For instance, you made Chirno work.
Yeah. I mean,
Chirno was your frontline tank, which is a completely weird place to put a character like that, but it's something you made work because they had the Blizzard Blowout to completely stall and speed down the opponents, and you had Aya to speed up, so you were able to capitalize throughout pretty much the majority of the game, even when Blizzard Blowout wasn't applicable.
right. Well, I mean, the thing that I noticed early in the game is that all of the bosses seem to really capitalize on speed for turn density.
Hmm.
Even the first boss on the first level, the squirrel thing, probably gets to attack, you know, 2 times for everyone for all of your front four characters. So it kind of gets that ridiculous turn density. I was noticing that a lot of enemies just seem to have these crazy high speeds compared to my characters, and so I started building a team that could kind of try to overcome that speed disparity. And yeah, Chirno as a frontline tank, albeit a disposable frontline tank, worked
Hmm.
really well because of Blizzard Blowout. And then sometimes she would stay alive long enough to do some good cold damage. It was an interesting kind of strategy that I just kind of stumbled onto just by observing how fast, because it just seemed like every enemy was so fast compared to my people, and so Aya
Yeah.
became what's the word, like a constant in my party. Like
Hmm.
like even though Aya is not my favorite character in any sense, like she probably has the most battle points by
Yeah.
like a large margin because she was always in the front line and she was always in the party because throughout what 80-90% of the game, the first
Hmm.
thing I would do was I would have her speed boost everybody else and herself just to get myself enough turn density that my kind of suboptimal party could keep up with some of these later enemies.
Yeah, in my instance, instead of using Aya like you did, I ended up using Aaron in my playthrough to overheal people using the healer subclass, and so
Yeah.
there are certain strategies that you kind of just want right away, and certain team setups and everything like that are probably going to go for that for a lot of people, I'd imagine, because having an opening act in a game like this is really powerful and important.
Yeah.
That goes double because both of us ended up using Iku.
Yep.
So that was another thing because Stickleback was the strongest buff in the game for attack and magic, and attack buffs and magic buffs are completely the thing you want to go for more often than not because
And
even the
and
defensive buffs fell
yeah.
off.
Well, like it's one of those weird things about the game where in the first part of the game, defense and mind do a thing. Like they're
Mhm.
useful. It makes sense
Yeah.
to build them up. Then later in the game, they kind of the numbers get so absurdly high that defense and mind don't do that much, and so you end up focusing on hit points instead. And
Hit
even
points and
then,
affinities, yeah.
yeah, hit points and affinities, and then it gets even worse because certain enemies have attacks that can't be dodged and attacks that have piercing anyway, and so you end up behind that wall as well, and so you end up trying to figure out how to cope with those kinds of attacks. And you learn one of the cool things is that you learn all these different tactics and ideas, and the game kind of encourages you to learn that as opposed to just letting you kind of coast through and relax.
Yeah, of course. And there are plenty of good example bosses that you can learn about. Like, I remember the early one on was Moko.
Mm-hmm.
Moko having really nasty fire damage, but the game was throwing you fire resistant items in the water level,
Right.
making it a standout, being like, huh, why is it giving me fire resistance? We're in the water level. Then you
Right.
run into a fire boss and it kind of just like clicks like, oh, that's why.
Right.
And that's a really cool way to teach the player. I think there are a lot of really cool diegetic forms in there. What the game does tell you is really strong as a foundation, but what it doesn't tell you can be frustrating, like you
Yeah.
mentioned.
It's frustrating if you're not ready for it. You like
Oh, yeah.
I remember that. What was that? It's like the magic tome boss or something. I forget the exact name of it, but it's basically a boss that in
Ether
its first
flare.
turn it concentrates, and then in the second turn it just ether flares and it just wipes the party. And so you literally have to figure out a strategy to beat it or to prevent it from getting that ether flare off because you pretty much can't tank it at that part of the game.
Yeah. And there are other bosses that have their own unique gimmicks, like
Yeah,
detonations and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, there are lots of different characters you could use for that sort of thing. And being stuck with a bad team can be a bit of a downer, but the game does have some ways around that. Thankfully, with things like Tomes of Reincarnation, you can completely divest all the stuff you spent in one character and put it into another. So
yeah,
the game has these nice little checks and balances for itself so that people won't get stuck. Whereas mentioned before with the instant win buttons in the back, like in Nitori, Renko, and
yeah,
so on. Yeah. And while you have characters that may be considered broken in some sense, like Mei Ling, for instance, they aren't as broken if you aren't taking advantage of their broken mechanics, like, say, using her natural plus Aaron to overheal to an absurd degree, making her one
right,
of the most impressively crazy tanks in the entire game, but you didn't use Aaron with Mei Ling, so that made her a bit more of a balanced character. Likewise, I never used any natural characters on my team, which prevented that issue from cropping up and making me feel a little more cheap. Having a rounded team like I had really
yeah,
was nice in the
yeah,
sense that I had foresight and hindsight. You were kind of just going through the motions, and a lot of the things you were doing was semi blind. Like
yeah,
in your half blind review, when you started that, I initially made the suggestion to play it because it seemed really interesting to see a half blind review, but weird to not see the game be backed up on the channel. And it was nice to see you do that. And I just have to say, thank you so much I didn't expect you to take that suggestion to heart, but I really do thank you for the chance to be able to see a full playthrough of the game because, yeah, it is definitely one that has been untapped on YouTube and other places. So it's been really fun seeing somebody actually go through all of the game's content.
Yeah. I mean, I had fun with it. I mean, like, so it's one of those games where it's so the whole game is so long that you almost don't expect, and the gameplay doesn't really vary that much throughout the game. I mean, certainly there are some tricky bosses, but like by the time you've gotten 20 or 30 hours into the game, you can say the graphics are this, the music is this, the it's a very hard you know JRPG style dungeon crawler with a very large cast of characters. There's a lot of you can kind of explain the gameplay to a person with about 20 to 30 hours in the game, but then actually going through everything pretty much, because I can't say I actually went through everything, because there's that light right at the beginning that makes those bosses down on, what is it, 20 something, 21
Stronger, yeah.
stronger. And I only beat one of those,
But
so
you exhausted the game of all the new content you had to see, so
basically, yeah. And the only thing you gain from fighting those bosses is the ability to buy the stuff that they drop in the Infinity Corridor, which I had already finished with the Infinity Corridor at that point. So it was like, well, I'm not going to use any of that, so we're pretty good. But
for the sake of it, Karunik, I want to run something by you. Do
yeah,
you want to know what that part of the game is like, coming from somebody who's been through it?
yeah,
It's ridiculous. So the bosses start scaling up so rapidly and so fast that it gets to the point where speed becomes a completely irrelevant stat, because speed being so high at that point
yeah,
instantly fills the ATB bar,
right,
whereas you didn't quite get to that point. You were very near it at the end,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
you beat the game basically where Labyrinth of Touhou 2 is still Labyrinth of Touhou 2, but once you go into the late game through the light,
yeah,
the game kind of devolves into a turn-based game because it does not have the means to keep that speed stat in check, and it in fact gets to the point where you actually Tome of Reincarnation every one of your party members and put 0 level ups in speed in the
yeah,
library,
yeah,
and
yeah,
basically only use speed like in Pokemon, where you can have it 1 point over and just get the turn before then, which also ruins subclasses like, ironically enough, the Dragon's God Power, which has a lot of those per turn based things.
right, right,
Characters like Kogasa, and even some of the useful passive buffs like Flandre and Midoriko, who can basically do Iku's job on a passive level for a front line.
right, right.
But
No,
yeah,
yeah. Go
it's
ahead.
it's crazy that the game gets to that point, and there's not much to show for it at this point other than like like Kine once said, we're just doing this because we can.
Right, right. Well, it's funny because like basically the game has content all the way up, has new content all the way up to the point where basically all the systems in the game start to break down, right?
Hmm.
Like, you know, it's funny, like with the speed thing. The reason that happens is because the number of your ATB bar fills up to 10,000, and whenever it's above 10,000 or above is when you get a turn. And for any person who is above 10,000, or if there's multiple people above 10,000, they get their turns in order of their ATB numbers, right?
Yeah,
Highest
highest
first,
value.
and nobody gains anything else while that queue of people with ATB above 10,000 are going through their moves. And so like you end up in this situation where a single quote unquote tick of the game becomes 5,000-6,000 ATB for every character, including enemies and bosses. And so yeah, everybody's just always above 10,000 because the way that your moves work is that they don't usually take all of your ATB away either. It's one of those systems that works up until that point in the game, and by then it's starting to break down. Whereas they could have fixed it by making it so that because like your speed is like 100,000, and when your speed is 100,000, you get 6,000 ATB per tick, right? But they could have made that tick size dynamic and kept the speed dynamic throughout the game with just a couple of lines of code. Basically, at the start of each battle, you check what the highest speed participant in the battle is, and make it so that their tick size is 1,000 instead of
Yeah.
6,000.
And then you got the hilarious breakdown of that mechanic of speed to the point
Yep.
where the real speed is actually in characters with lower delays. So characters that move at a glacial pace like Patchouli and Tenchi actually become some of the fastest characters in the end game because their attacks have low delay, and and that'll mean that the real speedsters are the ones with the lowest delay completely. And that's the funny part about the whole thing. Whereas you have characters like Iku who just have a naturally really high base speed to the point where they don't even need investment to be able to get turns and be able to do what they do best, which is spam normal attacks. And there are certain other aspects and characters that can do the same.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the breakdown of mechanics like that at the end is really funny to see, but it's also to the point where there is a little bit of value that you can get out of certain things. For one, having a void as a concern for certain bosses actually does value some stats like defense and mind, which are your only real defense against void and stuff like that, because affinities and other than that, quartz charms are the only thing that you can use. And it's funny how that item became pretty much the go-to meta choice because it actually scales up in usefulness as opposed to the other items that barely gave you a boost compared to level up bonuses in library.
Right. Well, I mean, it's one of those things where it's another system breaking down. Like normally in a JRPG, you get better equipment, and the equipment gives you, bonuses to your stats. And in this case, they put an item into the game where it's like, oh, it doesn't give you bonuses to your stats. Oh, so it's useless? No, it's not useless. Well, what do you mean it doesn't give me bonuses to my stats? Well, what it does is it reduces the damage that you take by 20%. Well, that sounds decent, but I mean, like, right now I think my defense is doing more than that, and boosting my defense would give me a better return. Oh, don't worry. All of these things, all of the stats of the enemies, they increase quadratically, not linearly. And so eventually that 20% is going to blow out whatever your defense and your affinity is doing by a pretty significant amount. Because these numbers just rise so rapidly that 20% of reduction in base damage is a way larger effect than the effect of your affinity followed by your defense on the damage after it goes through the affinity or whatever like that. It's kind of funny because, like, when you look at it, like, the quartz charm is the meta final best overall equipment, and yet it's a page 6 sub equipment.
Yeah, and no less the last piece of equipment that you're supposed to get from the post game. So it makes sense why some of the last chests you had in the plus disc was starting to give quartz charms. So the creator does in fact acknowledge that these items have their way and work a very specific way. And it's like, I've always found that interesting because that does break down the mechanics in a sense, but there are some characters in the game that can still make use of defense and mind, besides Renko, of course, because Renko can make use of defense and mind to the point of
maintenance too.
Yeah, to the point where they can make most of the damage they take either 0 or 1. So but you get certain characters that have certain synergies, like, say, Tenchi or Wriggle, Wriggle has this thing where if she poisons something, she gets this big defense buff and stuff
Yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Or you have Iku, who, with Tenchi out in the field, can get a 40% buff to her defense and mind, and
yeah,
give Tenchi the vice versa in attack and magic. Well,
yeah.
Tenchi's never going to make use of the magic, but it's the similar idea. And so you
Sure.
could actually get some value out of investing into the library in those things if you're getting a big boost like that. But if you're not
Yeah,
getting a big boost like that, it is almost to the point where you can reset a character and just invest nothing into defense in mind, and you'll still be able to tank just fine
yeah,
with
yeah, yeah.
very limited, minimal, or even no investment at all.
Yeah, it's
It's
pretty amazing how it. Well, like the other thing I was thinking is that the systems don't just break down; they like break down in stages,
yeah,
which gives you which makes you alter your strategy. Like part way through the game and then another part way through the game kind of thing. Like that's also an interesting aspect of this game that I'm not sure that it was fully intentional, but like probably during playtesting they discovered that this was happening and they're like, oh yeah, it's because blah 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 blah. Okay, we need to set this up to do this. You spend all this time in the regular game, like, oh man, I have this item that gives me plus 100 resistance to fire. I have like three of them, and like I got to be really careful about who gets those because those are really important in a lot of boss fights. And then later on, you're just like, yeah, I have this thing that gives me 178% increase to every resistance,
yeah,
and some people need them. Some people, it's not the best item to put on them.
yeah. For instance, you had a good example of this is actually part of your party. Kasen.
Yeah.
Is a great example of this because Kasen still tanks very well despite being in your back row and setting up with like her summon ability, and then you use Swordmaster stance to get adversity bonuses.
Right.
She can
Right.
still tank even with the minus in defense in mind that she gets from Swordmaster stance, abusing
Yeah.
adversity because adversity gives this ginormous damage bonus,
Right.
and all she has for defense is like her fighting spirit, and fighting spirit is more than good enough, even by some metrics in the early part of the game where defense in mind were there. But that's really just an interesting sort of introspection because you had characters like Komachi, for example, which had the highest base HP in the game as a
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
And the thing that made Komachi interesting compared to ours, anyway, is I had my Komachi EXP boosted
Yep.
as kind of like my main staple because that gave her ludicrous amounts of HP to get level up bonuses on top of that. Whereas your Komachi ended up being an HP sponge tank using narrow confines as support for the team.
Hmm.
Whereas I use mine as a bulky support that either sat in the second line or the front line and just absorbed and used HP recovery.
Yeah.
And she recovered an absurd amount of HP every time, so she didn't really need an overheal all the time. And
Right.
when she did, it was for a gimmick like the final fight of the game.
Right. Right. Well, the fun thing about Komachi was that she has really high HP but really low defense in mind, and so in
Yeah.
the early part of the game, she's not actually that great of a tank because defense and mind are still important. And like unless you're really, 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 really hitting that HP and focusing on that a lot,
Hmm.
and if you're playing in kind of like the hard mode, version, you can't just overpower her HP that much.
Hmm.
So if you're not using Aaron, Komachi's kind of a passable but not great tank early in the game, and then later in the game when everybody's defense in mind is irrelevant compared to the overall damage numbers that you're dealing with, suddenly Komachi's HP is increasing quadratically along with the damage that enemies are doing, and all of a sudden, even if you didn't intend her to be a tank, she suddenly becomes tanky, and it's one of those things where organically, because of the way that the game systems are like breaking down,
Hmm.
you end up having to change strategies and it adds more depth and variety to the game, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's like Komachi isn't even a bad tank in some metrics in the base game if you know what you're doing,
Right,
because you can also, in something like hard mode, increase her affinities as well.
right,
And
right.
the affinities still have, I'd say they have global usefulness throughout the entirety of the game, because the biggest thing I remember you focusing on was affinities back when you were playing the base game. You were trying to use affinities more than defense and mind, and that ended up panning out a lot more than just raw defense and mind investment.
That's true. Yeah. But the thing is that with an early game, affinities are a lot harder to actually like
Boost up, yeah.
boost. Yeah, like because the best items you have are sub equipments that raise it 100 points out of a
Hmm.
total maximum of 500, right? And
Yep.
so like and you don't have a lot of materials to make a bunch of those items, and so it's basically, ooh, I have this character, I have a boss fight against someone who uses fire. I'm gonna put my fire defense items on my people who have the lowest native fire resistance, so they don't just get nuked immediately, right? And then
Yeah.
like you have the further issue of the fact that like the library levels for
Affinities.
affinities are really expensive early in the game as well,
Oh, yeah.
compared to what you get per money, and so you end up spending your money on basically you spend your money on like bailing water, I guess. Like there's a character,
Mhm.
your character has a horrible. Well, no, you can't even do that. You end up so like you have a character that has a base 50 resistance of something. You can't even do that with library levels, because all that does is, if you spent a million money on them to get that all the way up to 100, you still only get from 50 to 100, right? Because it just doubles it. So you
Yeah.
end up focusing on like characters that have high base resistances, and you put a couple of levels into the library for the resistances there, and you get outsized gains, because if they started out at 180, then you get 30 points. You can get up to 180 more points by leveling up that affinity in the library. But in the library, you spend your money on defense and mind, and then you spend your materials basically making sub equipments to give you those 50s and hundreds, in the regular main game.
Yeah, so even if you're not using Yomu or Yuka to solo the base game,
Mm-hmm.
there are other systems in place for those of you playing hard mode of the game and having to get through that part of the game. You can always grind to get more money to level up your affinities there to that cap, because wink wonk, that's a pretty solid idea for getting around bosses.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of the thing, right? Once you get to
Yeah.
the point where you can actually level up your affinities to their cap, to the point where you can't level them up anymore, then the game starts getting to the point where, yeah, affinities are just going to be always resistant. And then you have the second best item in the game, the regalia,
Right.
which is basically a souped up version of the 7-star sword that you get from Eco at a little while. And for a while, that one will be your kind of breadwinner when it comes to affinity resistance. But once you get to that point with Regalia and a multiple of them, you can just put 2 Quartz Charms and a Regalia on a team, and that's pretty much your setup for most characters. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny how all of the like massive number of equipment things that you get in the game all kind of distills down to two quartz charms and a regalia on everybody at the end.
yeah. And that's probably not going to be too interesting to some people, but the fact of the matter is it is quite interesting based on the effects it has on the characters. It kind of just makes them a character you use for the sake of it being them. And
Yeah.
so I do like that about the game, that the game gives so many new tools and pieces of kit to the characters that they still remain interesting even if the item diversity is narrowed down to that little amount, because awakenings are a wonderful thing in this game.
Yeah.
And you start out with subclasses and stuff like that, and then you start getting all these new ways to boost characters. So it never becomes this point where characters stop being interesting, because they tend to get more interesting, because you can not only boost them with an awakening, but you can boost
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
with a mega tome, a veteran tome, to get the mega boost,
Right.
and then you can buy their awakening items to get them just a raw damage boost and stuff like that. As Karunik knows, my Komachi was different to theirs, in the sense that their Komachi did not have any of their awakening bought items, but I had like 50 on my
Right.
one, which I just bought because I was saving all the infinity gem chest until I could get it at 201. Yeah,
Right.
201, and then I opened a bunch of chests, so I got over that cap, and I just invested it all into one character. And the game even encourages this by making your favorite character bias show in the achievements and the awakenings.
Right.
And it outright says it's that type of game after all. So it's the game that will support your favorites. So that's a nice thing about it. Even if your favorite character is Momiji, in a game where Momiji has very little options to their name, you
Yeah.
can still make them work through all the boosting methods that are given to the game. And oh goodness, the stat inflation.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. It's. I would say that the one thing that I think. So the new game plus.
Hmm.
Originally, the new game plus, you get the new game plus, and you get all of your base game characters.
48 of them, yeah.
Yeah. Well, like, you don't get 48 of them at the start, right?
Yeah,
You get the new game plus, and then you keep getting more characters, and eventually you reach the 48. And then the one problem that I think is that you don't get those additional 12 characters
from the
added to the new
yeah.
game plus, which is like. So you mean if I did it, I think it's like one major oversight, because it's like the one place in the game where you actually lose something. Like,
Hmm.
just to give a little background, in the first Labyrinth of Touhou game, if you wiped the party, you lost your progress, right?
Yeah, you had to reload a save if you
Right.
wiped.
In this one, all that happens when you get a full party wipe is that you just end up back in the town. You don't lose any money. You don't lose any experience. You don't lose any items. And so
Hmm.
it really lends itself to the kind of trial and error and, oh, I'm going to poke at this boss and see what weaknesses it has. I'm going to try to figure out what its elemental attacks are like, how it reacts to my moves, kind of thing. And you can do that without losing anything. In the same way, they only give you a few tomes of reincarnation. It'd be nice if there were a few, if those were a little bit more easy to get. But if you throw a bunch of stuff into a character and you just discover they're not working, then you can in fact get your stuff back and give it to somebody else.
Hmm.
When you get the new game plus, you get up to the 48 characters, but then you don't get the last 12, and so that means that if you want to start a game. If you want to play a game with one of those 12 or one or more of those 12, you need to get all the way to the point where you get them in the plus disc
Or you can
before
go
you
out of
can.
the way to use a community-made hacked save file that adds them.
Yes,
But
yeah, you could hack your save file. Someone might have a mod for that someday or something like that. But still, I'm just from a design perspective, this is one of the few places in the game where you actually lose something,
yeah,
which I think is maybe a little bit of an oversight, but it
yeah.
is what it is.
And in my instance, I ended up using a community-provided save file that added those characters to the game, and so I gave
Yeah,
them a good, honest-to-God try and stuff like that. And
yeah,
yeah, it's very interesting to have characters that you're not normally supposed to have in that part of the game, because the new game plus only goes up to Maribel, and then
Right.
stops, like you mentioned. And well, Tomes of Reincarnation, that point you mentioned, does somewhat get helped by things like the Infinity Corridor, in the fact that
Yes.
it's pretty cheap in the shop that you get it in.
Yes.
Yeah, it's still a little bit of an investment, and you kind of wish the game gave you more passive Tomes of Reincarnation like it did in the base game, but stopped doing it plus disc.
Yeah. The perfect number, right, would be 48 minus 12.
Or at
You know,
least a
because
number that was congruent with all the allies you get.
that's what I mean,
Yeah.
right? Like in the main game, you get I think 19 of them, but like hypothetically,
Hmm.
you could start with you. Hypothetically, you might decide your first playthrough. You might decide in your first playthrough that the last 12 characters you get before the plus disc starts are the ones that you want to play with, and
Hmm.
so you don't have enough tomes of reincarnation to like pick a
Get you
group of
through
12
it.
at the beginning and then make a few changes in the middle of the game and then move on to that, everything is in these last 12 characters. You just don't get enough of them to do that to a certain degree. So like yeah, I mean, now, to be fair, you do have the ability to like do skill resets and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So all you really lose is money because you just can't get those library levels back out. But it is one of those things where, just from a design perspective, if someone was gonna try to, if someone on their first playthrough wanted to play with the last 12 characters, for instance, they aren't gonna have enough tomes to make that happen without significant losses of investment. And since the game does become grindy at the very end, you do want to make sure that those investments don't get wasted, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, of course. Speaking of grindy, let's talk about the Infinity Corridor because,
Okay.
oh boy, there's there's a lot I have to say about the Infinity Corridor itself. My goodness gracious, that place is either the biggest slog or the biggest nothing burger, I'd
Well,
say.
the thing about it was that like when it first appeared, I had run out of places to explore in the main map, right?
Hmm.
And so it was like, oh, cool, I can do exploration here and get random items, and they're actually pretty good random items, and that's kind of a cool thing.
Hmm.
The So like there's two ways to deal with this from a design perspective, right?
Hmm.
Because what you want to avoid as a designer is you want to avoid the game getting grindy. And so what you do is you either create like these massive, there these gigantic maps that you can explore through, which exploring them fully gives you more than enough steps to trigger more than enough encounters to get more than enough experience to get through the next area, kind of thing, right? Like there's a dungeon crawler called Mary Skelter that
Hmm.
has it's kind of a wizardry style dungeon crawler. And setting aside all the other aspects of that game, one thing it does very well is it has these gigantic maps for you to explore, which allow you to gain all the experience points and money that you need in the game without ever having to, you know, go back and forth over the same, 10 steps kind of thing. You do a little bit of that later because you need to grind certain enemies for like quests, but that's all totally optional kind of thing. And so like when I first got to the Infinity Core, I was like, "Oh, cool! This is something new to explore." But then what happens is that you realize that you're going to be that the way that the corridor is set up is that the longer you spend in it, the better your return on investment becomes. And so you end up with these, and there's no way to save in the middle of it and like set it down and walk away. The
Hmm.
best you can do is turn the volume off and like minimize the program and go walk away and do stuff,
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I would end up playing these like 8-hour grueling runs in the Infinity Corridor, trying to get to because the max number of floors that you can do and still get more bonuses from the remnants, like the carryover remnants is like 50. And
Hmm.
usually if you're playing it in a complete way, you end up at 200 infinity gems by around 30 floors. And it would still
Hmm.
take like 6, 7, 8, 9 hours to do that in a thorough way. which means that that's like one really long aspect of the game. And here's the thing: in the main game, they give you new colors, new backgrounds, new music every 3 floors, but the entire Infinity Corridor is just one background. Well, no, two backgrounds technically, and one music piece, which gets really grueling over
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, not visually too distinct, not distinct in its use of music in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
About the only thing you get as a shakeup to the music is in some of the bosses, where you get the FOE music, and then that one boss that has an original track that kind of breaks it up to the
Yeah.
point where, yeah, these 8-hour grueling sessions you talk about are a part of the game that's expected of you in a really not so kind of good way, to the
Right.
point
Right.
where,
No, because
y-
at the start I could just do like 10 floors.
yeah,
And it would take me like 2 hours, and it's like cool. I had a little fun in the Infinity Corridor, and then I could go back to regular game. But later on, you're just doing 30, 30 floors in one run, and you're just in there for 8 hours
try,
fighting the same enemies over and over again. Ugh.
trying to get quartz charms and all sorts
Right.
of other things and stuff like that until you have enough to say, all right, I'm done. I don't need to do anything more with the Infinity Corridor.
Yeah.
And then the Infinity Corridor becomes your grind spot after you touch the yellow light, because it gives you that 1000 bonus to
Yeah.
EXP. And you see that's kind of where the one video I showed you in the server,
Yeah.
where somebody basically got to a point where they could not continue in the corridor at all.
Right.
And it's places like that where I'd say, yeah, the game breaks down especially bad in the Infinity Corridor, because that's pretty much what you have to do. 8-hour long grueling sessions with no saves between. So good luck if you have a power outage, because you're essentially back to Labyrinth of Touhou 1 then.
Oof. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's what I think the game kind of falls behind in, because the Infinity Corridor is not really a fun thing to do unless you're speeding through it, kind of like you did at the end
Well,
there.
that was the thing. I switched strategies because I had enough quartz charms. Right. I had more. I had almost. I never quite. I don't think I ever reached 24 quartz charms, or
Hmm.
maybe I did eventually.
I
But
think you
like,
did, yeah.
I had enough that I could put one on everybody, and there's enough of those really high level exclusive equipments that you could put a regalia, a quartz charm, and a special item on all your 12 people, and that was still pretty good. Like you could swap it out for the quartz charm. In some cases, it's like kind of an even trade off. Sometimes even the quartz charm isn't quite as good as some of those really really late game items, but like
Hmm.
at least on the enemies in the normal dungeon. Like, of course, once you get to the lower levels of Infinity Corridor, that scale up of of damage just continues, and then the Quartz Charm really becomes your only choice. But like,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I finally had enough of what I needed from the Infinity Corridor that I was like, cool. I think I'm going to try something different because I'm tired of these 8-hour slogs, and I switched over to basically running through it as fast as I could, and I discovered two things. Number one, you still get almost as many infinity gems. Not quite. Like it took me I think 40 levels to get to 200 infinity gems.
Hmm.
In one case, and it was a little slower most of the time. Like that was my best. But like you still get almost as many infinity gems because you're not using up as much of your amulets walking around, and you still get a decent number of quartz charms. Like I was getting, one or two per delve, which is not as good as you would get if you were really really trying to maximize the number of remnants you had, and then saving remnants to spend on quartz charms.
Hmm.
But like at the same time, it still worked out pretty well for me. So, I will say that if you're playing this game and the Infinity Corridor gets to the point where you can't take it anymore, number one, try turning off the music and playing it with some of your own background music. That helped.
Hmm.
And then number two, you might even try switching up and doing a speed run through a certain number of floors and see if that refreshes it a little bit for you,
Yeah.
because it seems like you would lose a lot by doing that, but in fact most of what you lose is like you get instead of getting 1,000,000 Excaliburgs, you now don't only get 20 Excaliburgs.
Yeah. Even speaking of which, it's not actually that useful to get those end game bosses once you touch the light and get the ability to buy them in the store. At most,
Yeah,
the Chaos Dark Sword, you can stack 3 of them and get some fun out of that on some characters, but at that point, that's only like a niche strategy. And even with other things like the King's Reason, that's the only item in the game that can get the debuff resistance cap over, so you can finally use Hina and Aya's synergy together if you want.
yeah,
And it's stuff like that that just kind of it screams niche at this point. Why would I invest any of that amount of remnants into stuff like that when I can just get
right.
some quartz charms, which are way better than all these items now?
Well, I mean, by the end of the game, once you've gone through 640 floors of the Infinity Corridor. By the way, they should have made it a boss every 5 floors instead of every 10. That would have helped a lot.
Yeah, it would
Um,
have.
but like once you get down there, you almost have 36 quartz charms just naturally at that point, unless you've been
Hmm.
really really bad about because they'll drop. Like I had these crazy cases where I would open up like a 2 exclamation point chest down there,
And
and there'd
get
be a
one.
quartz charm in it, and I'd be
Yep.
like, what? And like that happened a couple of times. So by the time you have 36 quartz charms, you don't need any more. You literally can't use them. You could literally put 3 quartz charms on your entire team, right?
Yeah,
And
with the 36 multiple
yeah,
of
and so
12.
like you don't even need quartz charms at that point. At that point, the remnants. The only thing the remnants are good for is like if there's any of those end game items that you want to get a couple more of, you can do that. But you can do that pretty slowly by just the fact that you can go through 5 floors, gather 1,000 remnants, and then you kick out, and like 200 of them get saved or something like that kind of thing. And you can just kind of build them up slowly that way.
Hmm.
It's You could even build them up. Well, the one thing you can't do that probably they should have allowed you to do is build them up on the same floor, because in
Hmm.
order to trigger the remnant carrying over thing, you have to pass through at least one floor. So anyway,
Yeah.
it becomes niche at the end to the point where it's like only if you really 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 want to do these things do you do these things, and they're not necessary. You don't unlock any new content by doing so.
Yeah. And even if that's a small portion of the game, the main game is good enough because I have a confession to make. I did not make it through the Infinity Corridor to the same place you did because I just found it too much of a slog to do.
I mean, I understand completely, right? Like it's one of those things where, and it was like fighting that last boss was even like surprising because like I ran out of characters to fight before I realized that I was running out of characters to fight. Like all of a sudden, it just stopped. It just stopped summoning people, and I
Hmm.
was like, "Wait, are we done?
Yeah.
Really?"
And it's all
Because
random. Yeah, it's
yeah,
all
it's all
random.
random, and so you either get lucky or you don't. I just happened to get lucky, and I got kind of things spawned in a timely way, and they
Yeah,
never spawned 2 things together at the same time that made it impossible to continue.
and that's saying a lot considering you got friggin' Moko who could have easily
Yeah,
sniped you to death in that. So
yeah,
I thought your luck wasn't going to be too great since Moko showed up, but it ended up working out.
yeah.
And
And it's
it's
not like even that boss is not any new real content.
yeah,
It's the 56 bosses you just fought plus one more that has a trick to it, a very minor trick to it.
yeah, can't damage it until all the clones are dead.
Yeah, so like that's not even. I wouldn't even. I would barely call that content. It's a sprite, and
Yeah.
that's it.
Yep. I 100% agree with you there. Yeah. Honestly, I don't feel like I'm missing much by not getting to that point in the game. And
Right.
it's like, yeah, there are some shortcomings. I'd call the Infinity Corridor divisive. There are people that are probably going to love it if they like delving through random stuff and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
for for the instance of the style of game this is, I really don't think it has the best place in my slot, and
No,
like
I mean
you
it was
skipping
one of those things
through.
where it was refreshing when it first showed up, and then it quickly wore out its welcome.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thankfully, the rest of the base game did not have too much of that of wearing out its welcome feeling to it, even when the
No, I
grinding
mean like
happened. By the
there
time
there
you
was
had to grind, you were actually into the game at that point, so
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you had a neat system to grinding based on as early as the 20th floor, where you had those FOE styled guys to grind off of even in
Right,
the
right,
post game. And then you had the heavenly shades that you
right.
could face off against, which made grinding interesting again because it gave you some musical variety and stuff of that nature.
And a little bit of tactical variety too. Like I never got to the point where I could just wipe the floor with them. So it
Hmm.
was always like, okay, I got to fight this one. I'm fighting Aku. I got to try to make sure that I have someone that I hit her as hard as I can before that invulnerability comes out, and then
Invincibility
yeah,
absorption.
and then hit her with magic before the magic invincibility comes out to finish her off, kind of thing. Like that was as far as I got in that. And so like it was always kind of fun to fight 56 different fights, kind of as fast as I can,
Hmm.
and the risk to reward for it was pretty good too, because you get even if you're not optimizing it, even if you're just going through and fighting them, you get a pretty decent amount of experience and a pretty decent amount of money for that. And then it became fun to like, okay, I'm going to have Nazarin in the front, and she's going to take out some of the bosses with the thing that increases the money they drop, and some of the bosses with the thing that increases the experience they drop, depending on which one they
Rare
kind of
metal
are
detector
are
and gold
better on that.
rush.
Yeah, yeah, right, right, right. And it became fun to try to like get Nazarin in right at the end to do that little bit of damage to finish them off with those bonuses. You know, just going through the whole thing in some kind of order, trying to kind of like, okay, this time I did it in 50 minutes. The next time I'm going to do it in 45, kind of thing. It was, and you get good bonuses out of it, so it was kind of like worth it, and it was enough to push me over the edge to beating the quote unquote final boss. Whereas like the other thing about the Infinity Corridor is that the enemies in it don't drop anything.
Hmm.
Like considering how hard they are to fight and what levels they're at, like, oh no, I got 10,000 money from this fight. Woo!
Yeah.
you know?
So I want to ask you something real quick,
Yeah.
Karunik. How do you feel that you have a let's play of this game on YouTube where you have a character that people said was unviable, your favorite character Nazarene, and you showed everybody, the entire world, that hey, in fact, she is viable, and this is
I
how?
mean, yeah, I mean, it's very gratifying to at least show that, because like in a game like this where there's so much opportunity to min max, that's the kind of thing that you always see. You're like, oh yeah, I got the best strongest party, and I got through this game as fast as I possibly could. Whereas I thought it was actually kind of nice to kind of sit back and relax and pick some unconventional characters and show that they could be used in different ways and still kind of have some fun and have some effectiveness too. And so seeing Nazarin do things like there was that one time that like she just
One
like every
shot.
one of her things stacked at the same time, and she just wasted a boss in like one hit for like it was like whoa that's never
Ele-
happened before.
11 million something damage, something like that
Yeah,
from her cold spell.
right. And it was like wow that the Genji what was it that
Genji
stacked?
glove.
It was the Genji glove and her she had
Awakening.
like another she had her awakening on there too, and so like those both stacked at the same time, and she went from doing like 1 million damage to doing like 11
5.
million damage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's because Genji Glove actually, instead of saying it's listed 2 times damage, it actually gives
yeah,
a times 3, and Nazarene has
right.
that awakening with a 33% chance to deal double damage, so that was a
Yep.
5-time damage hit she did. Nobody on YouTube has showcased this. You're the first one to do it, and I think it's really awesome because it makes a character like Nazaren, who you wouldn't think to see outside of a Byakuran team, just
Yeah,
wasting certain bosses and also helping in very many derelict instances of other bosses because she does do some really high damage with that bonus and her boon, basically.
she has that ability to knock out buffs too sometimes. So
Yeah,
like,
Oracle.
yeah, like yeah, and yeah, I had her with the Oracle skill, and that helped out too. Like
Subclass, yeah.
yeah, it was fun doing that. It was fun keeping Chirno in as a frontliner when everybody was telling me not to do that. Right?
Yeah,
Like it was fun. It was fun having different ideas about characters and not and kind of like seeing what could happen and what worked and what didn't. Like you said earlier about having like a scout party to like poke at bosses and discover what the weaknesses are.
hmm
I used Hina that way early in the game, where like I would go in and have her use her
biorhythm.
massive debuff, and oh, this boss can be debuffed in defense and mind, but he can't be debuffed in attack, speed, or magic. So that would tell me, okay, so bring these characters that debuff, mind and defense, and don't bring these characters that debuff other things. Or like how my Komachi ended up becoming like Avicii heavy, and
hmm
like it was like all Avicii, like Avicii was kind of useless. The only thing it did well in the like the middle part of the game was it debuffed a bunch of stuff, and then all of a sudden she gets her awakening, and
Yeah.
it goes from being kind of useless to being, oh, it actually does damage now. And it
Not
was like,
only
wow, that
does
was
it do damage, but it
yeah,
actually scales because you had Aiki in the back giving her a passive bonus in
right,
her
right.
offensive capabilities for both attack and magic, which made her even more crazy with
Yep.
Avicii's.
And even through all that, like she still was pretty tanky, even with all of my points and stuff put into like attack and magic to make her do a little bit of damage too. It was fun seeing all those different things happen.
Yeah, and that wasn't even the most technically Komachi optimized you could have been, because the most optimized Komachi is the Warrior Komachi that
Yeah,
uses that 30% damage bonus on the Farage, like I
right.
showed you. But you made Avicii work because you not only invested some of your library levels into it, attack and magic, but also
Right.
HP, which gave her a HP edge over tanks like, say, Mei Ling,
Right.
who was relegated to the second slot because of Gatekeeper Nap.
Right. Yeah, like I mailing was good for tanking, but she couldn't be counted on to be hit.
Yeah,
Which is kind of a funny situation, but yeah.
yeah. So it's stuff like that where you find your own niches and your own nuances and your own teams, and it's really good. Yeah, like you may not have had the most optimized team in the world that the wiki expected you to have, so you
Right.
could take these bosses on at lower level thresholds comparatively, but it didn't end up mattering because you had your own nuances and you gave a fresh spin on new characters. And considering there are 56 characters that are in the game, the
Yeah.
replay value on this game is insanely high too. You can
Yeah.
have
And
very, very wildly different experiences with characters, and I think I like that about the game the most.
oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's other things too. Like there's those people who do the full. You showed me a couple episodes of this of like the full Yomu solo playthrough.
Yeah,
Like there's a lot of really goofy things that you could do in this game in like normal strategy, and there's a whole nother endless rainbow of things to try in like goofy challenge strategies to make things even more ridiculous. And it's all stuff that you can play around with and actually make work because of the amount of different systems that the game gives you to play around with things.
I wonder how much money somebody would put as a bounty for doing a Nuzlocke of this friggin' game, because that would be
Yeah,
that would be hell. That would be so
yeah.
bad. But yeah, I think that about covers it, honestly. I really
Yeah, I
like
think so.
Labyrinth of Touhou too. I thought it was a
And the
really
third
good
one is
time.
coming out too, right? Soon,
Yep,
hopefully.
Labyrinth of Touhou Try being
Yep.
translated actively too. It's going to likely get an English release on top of its release in Japanese, and
Yeah.
it's likely coming out on Steam too, which is going to be really neat to see. I am
Yeah.
very excited for it because it has the skills and it has a really neat little tree branching system,
Mm-hmm.
which is fitting given the second game had its own giant tree that you explored that very much didn't have just tree parts in it. So,
Right.
yeah, I'm very excited to see where the third game goes in all of this. I don't know if you're going to do a playthrough of it necessarily. It probably would be something you would consider on your own time with your own beast because
If the
really,
thing is that with the games being this long, if
yeah.
I was gonna do a playthrough of it, I would probably record it and put it up on YouTube, just because with this kind of game you don't want. I mean, like you don't want to spend. You don't want to play through it twice if you don't feel like it, kind of thing.
Hmm.
You know, you might like pick up like a community save and start from there and do some interesting challenge, but like throwing 300 hours into a game is rare already, and throwing 600 hours into a game is very hard to justify time wise.
Hmm.
So like because the way that my channel is set up is kind of just like an archive of playthroughs of games that I enjoy.
Hmm.
Yeah, probably a cut down playthrough of Labyrinth of Touhou 3 is probably in the mix at some point, but probably not immediately. Since I just finished playing this game for several hundred hours, I'm
Yeah.
probably going to take a break from it for a little while
Hmm.
and do a couple other things. But yeah, I'll probably get to it eventually.
Maybe I'll.
Just because it's one of those things where it's one of those like genre mixes that like just really appeals to me. Like
Hmm.
I love the Toho games. I'm not very good at them, like the shooter ones.
Oh
But
yeah.
but they're fun and they introduce a lot of fun characters and they have a lot of really good music. And I love dungeon crawlers. Like I own practically every dungeon crawler, like first person party based dungeon crawler that exists.
Hmm.
There are a few of those that I don't actually own, and like they're often like giant time sinks, and so I don't finish all of them. But I definitely play all of them and enjoy them.
Yeah.
But like you mix those two together, and you get something that's like I should play this because it's gonna be something that I like. And so, I mean, we might discover that LOT try is like super grindy or something, but my guess is that the creators are going to learn a few lessons from 2, and they're going to make an improved system, and it's going to be a little bit more smooth to play, and hopefully, and now that I know that the creators like to make puzzle bosses, I'm not going to get that frustration that I had the first time I tried playing through Labyrinth of Touhou 2,
Hmm.
right? Because it was a surprise. It's like
Yeah.
I could never beat this boss. That's how it feels, right? Like you're
Yeah.
fighting bosses and they're tough, but like you got your 12 people and you're switching them out and you're using attacks and you're healing and you're doing this and that, and it's like a standard JRPG fight, and then you get to this fight and the thing just wipes your whole party. And you're like, what?
All I'll
I
say,
don't.
all I'll say,
What can I do
Karunic,
about that? Yeah,
thank God you did not start with the first game. Because
yeah,
the
right.
first
Well,
game, oof.
yeah. Well, the funny thing is that I've played the first game, but because it's so hard to get running properly on like current hardware and make it like play decently on current hardware, because like I have a copy, but I open it up, I get this tiny little like 320 by 200 window, and like I can't make it bigger. And I've tried to figure out how to do it, but
DG
like
Voodoo
it's
is
just
going to
like
be the only solution there again.
right, and it's just like one of those things where it's like I don't feel like playing around with this enough, and
Hmm.
and like so like I've tried it, and it's like cool, there it is, and then I like set it down because it's like this isn't particularly enjoyable. But then the second one, when it finally came out on Steam, was pretty polished. The translations were good. The text looked nice. Like it had a lot of that polish that the modded to be an English version of the second one that you would get somewhere like DL Site it kind of looks a little hokey. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
so there's a little bit of an effect there of like, well, this kind of looks goofy, and it's hard to figure out what's going on because sometimes the text goes over the edge of the window kind of thing, and you might kind of be more willing to give that up than something that looks really really polished
Yeah.
like the Steam version does. And so like they're already working before the game is released with the translator on the English version. My assumption is that the English version for Try is going to be super polished
Oh yeah. The
from the very
translator,
beginning.
I think his name is Hakayen Blue. Yeah, they're
Hakanai Blue, yeah.
yeah, very very good. Very good at what they do.
And so, I have a feeling that the Try version is gonna come out on Steam, and it's gonna look really good, and it's gonna be really smooth, and it's gonna have a lot of improvements over the second one to make it a little bit not necessarily easier, but like
Accessible.
more accessible and like more comfortable to play.
Oh yeah.
And so, like, I'm hoping for that. We'll see. I mean, it might be one of those things where I play it for a couple hours and I discover, oh, they went back to all of the bad things that they did in the first one that made it difficult to play, and then maybe I just give up on it. But like,
But I'm not
if
expecting
if
it.
I'm not expecting that, there's a slim chance that it happens. If it does, I would probably pick it up and set it back down. But if it's good, if I enjoy it, then I'll probably record it because it's going to be another 300-hour game, 300 plus hour game probably, and I don't want to do that twice.
Man, I'm so excited. Man, I'm so excited for it though. Otherwise, and it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, just let that one sit in the oven for a good while, honestly. I'm not going to recommend you play it because I'm going to play the heck out of it first. So, if there are any crazy exploits, I can tell you about them.
yeah, yeah. I'll probably pick it up when it comes out, but it's one of those things that'll probably stay on my like Steam bought list, but didn't get installed, which is a annoying list to have. But there it
Yeah,
is.
it's an annoying list I have in my case, but Try is not going to be one of those games. I'm going to get it
Right,
and I'm going
right.
to play the heck out of it. So, thankfully, I'll be able to give you some sort of scouting for it.
Nice.
So, I'll happily do that for you. Maybe at some point I'll show you what the first game is like too on our own time, but otherwise, yeah.
You've shown me you've shown me a few videos, and you've shown me some of your own footage too. And no,
Hmm.
I mean like the changes that you've mentioned, I think are like
For the better.
serious balance issues. Like the you die and you have there's the you can't see bosses until you walk onto them kind of thing,
Yeah,
which is like
only one tile away. Oof.
that's practically game breaking. And then there's the you die, you reload a save, which is also practically game breaking. Like, and then
Goodbye
there's the fact
three
that like
hours of
didn't
grinding.
right didn't you say that like evasion just doesn't work in the game as well?
Yeah, there's an evasion stat, but everything hits. There is
Yeah.
no
So
evasion, so
like I feel like I'm not really in a hurry to play the first one. Um,
yeah.
you know, but like like I said, if the third one improves on two, then I'll definitely enjoy that because I do love dungeon crawls and I do love Toho stuff.
Yeah,
And mixing them together is like I gotta at least try it.
such a robust fan created series. Oh my gosh,
Yes.
there are so many cool things about Toho fan made games. It's amazing,
Yeah.
honest to God. But yeah, as for what I'd like to say as some closing thoughts, really,
Hmm.
I really want there to be a modding scene for the second game. There has been
Yeah.
some mods made for the first game, which
Uh huh.
sort of aim to address some of the problems while not being able to fix absolutely everything. It makes
Sure.
sense. I do really think that 2 would be an amazing thing to mod. It is so ripe with the potential to be able to mix and match things around. I really hope that there will be a modding scene for 2 because
Okay. Yeah. That would
th-
be nice.
there is potential for more characters, there is potential for fixed items and descriptions that actually tell you what things do.
Yep.
formula, showcases, all things like that. It would be really neat to see something like that in the future, and I
It would
really hope
be
that happens.
it'd be nice just to see like an additional like damage, because you have your attack stat, but your attack stat, the way that it goes into to attack damage, is like really obscure sometimes,
Mhm.
and like how it plays into, if there was just a number that was like attack power on your attack and on all of your like attacking spell cards, and you'd be like, oh, this one is 375,000, and this one is 345,000. So this one's a little bit better, assuming the same. Because like the way that you've been doing it is you've been fighting the squirrels on the first floor, right, to
Mhm.
like get base numbers down,
Yeah.
and that just seems like something that you shouldn't have to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Either way, do you have any closing thoughts of your own?
I mean, it's just one of those games that's an investment of time, but it's also kind of a positive investment, right? Like, yeah, it was a 300-hour game, and there aren't very many of those around. It was fun in places. It was frustrating in places. It had a good story through most of it. That was fun to see all the Toho characters interact, and a little bit of added fiction there. It was nice that it was so canon friendly. Once I learned that the boss fights were puzzles, it helped most of that frustration go away.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few issues with balance and pacing, but I think it's something that if you like Toho, you should at least check it out. Support the creator, and the creators will create more good stuff in this vein. I'd love to see more of it.
Yeah. Honest to God. Looking forward to try even more because of that, man.
Yeah,
I don't know if I'm gonna start a new playthrough again in a while, but when I do, I'm definitely gonna be able to take on a little bit more of what the game has.
yeah, yeah. The more you play it, the more you learn, and there's so much hidden information in the game, and and
Experience helps.
and like the people who are making the wiki are playing it very optimized, and so if you want to play it without all that optimization, you could also you could learn a lot, like I learned with Nazarin,
Hmm.
and you can also have a lot of fun picking at the edges of the game with setups that no one tells you to try.
Yep.
So yeah,
I'm glad I got to get your favorite character, the Limelight. I'm really
yeah,
glad I made those suggestions because that was the kind of inventiveness I needed.
yeah,
And
it
so
was fun.
I'm really glad in the end that I got to do all of those sheets for the
Yep,
videos and stuff like that because that was hard to do, but it was so much fun to be able to put that together because it got me to learn the ins and outs of the game's mechanics. It's there where
yep,
I learned things like, oh, Aaron doesn't work with Byakurin because Byakurin actually nerfs the overheal.
right, right.
And stuff like that is, honest to God, there are little things in that game, and I'm still probably not learned on everything the game has to offer. I know most
Of
of
course.
it, but
Yeah, yeah,
it's gonna take me some genuine experience with some other characters before I can call myself, the master of this kind of game and what it has to
right,
offer. Because there are some things that threw me for a loop even in this playthrough where I was using EXP grinding, so
right.
yeah. I don't have much more to say in that sense. I'm really happy with where this has gone. I'm really happy with where things ended up. I'm glad you played the game. I will always be endlessly thankful to you for playing this game at my
Well, I appreciate you
suggestion.
suggesting it, because I might have just left it alone if someone hadn't said, "Hey, maybe we should see a playthrough of this," because like it's one of those games where I picked it up, I played it, 20, 30 hours, to the point where I was like, okay, I kind of get the feel for it. But also the point where it's like, okay, I got frustrated at a boss, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll come back to this later. And you know how that is. You play a game for
Hmm.
X hours, and you get into it, and then something kicks you out of it, and you start playing a different game, and then you're like, oh, where was I? And you're like, I don't remember where I was. And then you fight the boss, and you're like, I can't fight this boss. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess I give up then, like that. So starting anew and going through the whole thing was it was good to be encouraged to do that, because it's one of those things where I might not have enjoyed, or it might have happened years later for me to enjoy the entirety of this game, and learn things like, oh, the bosses are actually puzzles and things like that.
Yeah,
So
I'm glad it's that sort of thing that clicked with you in the end too, because it's like, yeah, they are puzzles, and yeah, you figured out the puzzle. You are really good at this game when you can figure out things like this puzzles. And yeah, I'd say you definitely gave Tier List a run for their money too at the same time. So it was a nice little happy coincidence when everything clicked
yeah,
and you got to do all that.
yeah. It was one of those experiences that made me feel a lot of different things. It was fun at sometimes, it was frustrating at other times, it was grueling at sometimes, but then there was always like, oh man, this just worked, and we finally beat this boss that I've been trying to beat for the last X hours, and I finally figured it out. I finally got everybody tuned up just right. If you like min maxing in games, this game is absolutely for you. Because you can just play around so much with stats and things like that. So yeah, I mean, those cards that you were talking about that you made for all the awakenings, though there are pinned comments in a lot of my episodes, in like a big old string of my episodes, and Diz produced 4 cards per week for these things. And so if you're getting to the point of the end of the game, the end of the main game, and getting into the plus disc, go check out those episodes and check those cards out. They should be available through the links on the YouTube page. Those will lead to where the pictures are posted on my Discord server, but you don't need to be a part of my Discord server to see them. They're just available to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
They provide you with a ton of useful information about awakenings, and so once you start to get into the awakenings part of this game, when the Infinity Corridor opens up, they are super useful. So I would recommend anybody who happens to be playing this and getting into that part of the game, the early plus disc, to go check that out. But I will say, thanks, Diz, for hanging out and talking about the game.
Mm-hmm. It was
And let's
really
call
nice.
this, a review.
Yeah, thank you for the signal boost on my hard work there. I really appreciate it. And I'm really thankful again that you took my suggestion to heart. It was so
Well,
nice.
it was fun to actually get into this game and get into the nitty gritty. So yeah,
Take care, everyone.
thanks for suggesting it. Take care, everyone. Yeah, and I'll see y'all later.
Ciao.